Privyet, comrades, and welcome to another electric episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. This week's tale begins in Soviet Russia, where in 1963, Premier Nikita Khrushchev oversaw a project called the Krasny Dynamit, or Crimson Dynamo program. Now, I will note that in the original telling of this story, the Soviets did indeed create an armored agent to use against the West, but the specifics of these events have since been altered by the Sliding Timescale, and so in modern continuity, the original Crimson Dynamo project was eventually shelved without producing any significant results. Years later, however, the program was revived and entrusted to a scientist by the name of Anton Vanko. Originally born in Soviet Armenia as Anton Vanko before changing his surname to obscure his ethnicity, he ultimately became the world's leading expert on electrophysics, and his work with low-loss electrical capacitors at Moscow State University caught the attention of the Russian Defense Minister Shatalov, who assigned Vanko to the revived Crimson Dynamo project. The bulk of his work was done in a secret facility in Tomsk, Siberia, where Vanko and his research team developed a cutting-edge generator that utilized non-nuclear electromagnetic pulses. Using this Vanko generator as a power source, he and his team crafted the first real Crimson Dynamo armor. Notably, one of the scientists who helped Vanko was a propulsion expert named Alex Nevsky, who considered Anton Vanko to be a respected mentor and perhaps even a father figure. Vanko, however, looked upon Nevsky with suspicion, believing incorrectly that his young protege was actually a KGB agent sent by the state to spy on him. Over the years, Vanko created other weapons and technology for the Russian government, including the original equipment used by the intelligence agent Milos Masaryk, aka the Unicorn. However, Vanko also grew distrustful of the state during this time, and secretly began designing a second Crimson Dynamo suit even more powerful than the first. Developed without Nevsky's knowledge, this Mark II lacked the flight capabilities of the original, and Vanko ended up hiding most of the prototype in a Siberian storage facility. Meanwhile, it turns out that one of his team really was spying on him. It just wasn't Alex Nevsky. Another man, Boris Turgenov, was reporting back to the Russian government on Vanko's progress, and while he didn't learn of the Mark II, he did take notice of Vanko's growing distrust in the state. Government officials ultimately demanded a demonstration of the Crimson Dynamo's capabilities, and were impressed with the results. Believing him to be a match for the armored American hero Iron Man, Russia ordered Vanko to the United States, where he launched several successful attacks on Stark Industries, which at the time still operated as a weapons manufacturer for the US government. In the ensuing battle with Iron Man, however, the Crimson Dynamo was overpowered by his American opponent, and in the end, Stark tricked Vanko into believing that his superiors plotted to destroy him. Already distrustful of Russian politicians, this was all the motivation that Vanko needed to defect to the West, and he accepted an offer from Iron Man to join Stark Industries. In the wake of this, Russia dispatched two agents, the aforementioned Boris Turgenov and the Black Widow Natasha Romanoff, to retrieve both Vanko and the Crimson Dynamo armor. While Natasha used her charm to distract Tony Stark, Boris confronted and incapacitated Anton Vanko before donning the armor himself, becoming the second Crimson Dynamo. Fortunately, Vanko was soon rescued by Iron Man, who battled Boris. In the end, it was Vanko himself who defeated Turgenov with an experimental laser weapon he'd developed, resulting in an explosion that destroyed the Crimson Dynamo armor and killed both Vanko and Boris. Back in Russia, Vanko's defection had caused suspicion to fall onto his associates, including Alex Nevsky. Evading the authorities, Nevski traveled to the United States under the false identity of Alex Niven, and landed a job at Cord Industries, where he designed a more efficient fuel injection system for their rockets. He impressed his employer, Janice Cord, and began to romance her, but in the midst of all this, he was also using her company's resources to build his own Crimson Dynamo armor. Blaming Iron Man for his mentor's downfall and disgrace, Nevsky sought revenge on the armored Avenger. Meanwhile, Tony Stark wanted to retire from the world of superheroics, and at the recommendation of his trusted confidant, Happy Hogan, the role of Iron Man was entrusted to a former boxer named Eddie March, who accepted despite secretly suffering from a life-threatening medical issue. When Alex Nevsky, as the third Crimson Dynamo, attacked, March put up a valiant fight despite his condition, but was ultimately left unable to continue operating as Iron Man, and Stark, inspired by his bravery, returned to the role. In the midst of all of this, Janice Cord found Nevsky's Crimson Dynamo armor, forcing him to confess the truth of his identity. On top of that, Russian authorities dispatched another armored operative to apprehend him, Boris Bulsky, the Titanium Man, who wore a large, powerful battlesuit built by other scientists that had worked under Anton Vanko. What followed was a veritable free-for-all between Iron Man, Titanium Man, and the Crimson Dynamo, but during the battle, Janice Cord was killed, and a heartbroken Nevsky escaped. In the wake of this conflict, Nevsky blamed Iron Man for his lover's death and ironically later joined forces with the one who actually killed her when he convinced the Titanium Man to join him as a freelance agent. The duo relocated to Vietnam, where it would be difficult for other countries to pursue them due to an, at the time, ongoing conflict in that part of the world. They also recruited the Chinese superhuman Chen Lu, the radioactive man, and the Titanic 3, as they called themselves, became operatives for the Vietnamese government. They briefly clashed with the Avengers when a criminal known as the Slasher manipulated the two teams into fighting each other in an attempt to cover up his own theft of valuable jewels from the Diamond Exchange in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon. Suffice it to say, he ultimately failed and was arrested after his crime was exposed. Still seeking revenge on Iron Man, the Crimson Dynamo subsequently lured the hero into another confrontation, this time in an experimental city hidden beneath a Vietnamese mountain range, but Nevsky's reckless use of napalm ended up destroying this experimental metropolis. Iron Man saved as many of the city's civilians as he could, while Nevsky retreated back to Ho Chi Minh City to reunite with his partners. However, the Titanic 3 were soon defeated by Kang the Conqueror, whose search for a woman known as the Celestial Madonna, actually Mantis, had brought him to Vietnam. You can see my video on Kang the Conqueror for more details on that whole quest, but the important thing for today is that after he proved to be more of a liability than an asset, the Vietnamese authorities arrested the now weakened Crimson Dynamo and turned him over to the Russians. That was the last time anyone outside of Russia saw Nevsky alive, and he was reportedly executed after his armor was confiscated by the state. Nevsky's armor was then given to a more loyal Russian operative known as Yuri Petrovich, who became the fourth Crimson Dynamo. He was actually born as Yuri Ivanich Bezakov, the son of Ivan Petrovich Bezakov. If the latter of those names sounds familiar, it's because Ivan Petrovich was a longtime ally and former mentor to Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow. Suffice it to say, he's got a bit of a history of his own, having been a Soviet soldier all the way back in the 1920s, but in 1956 he received from the Winter Soldier a dose of a rejuvenating formula that vastly increased his lifespan. Then, around 2 decades before the Marvel Age, give or take a few years, Ivan Petrovich Bezakov had a son named Yuri. When Yuri Bezikov was 5 years old, Russian agents concocted a convoluted plot to mold him into a loyal operative. Posing as Americans, they murdered Yuri's mother and abducted Yuri himself, taking him to a facility in Germany where they trained and educated him for 9 long years. When he was ready, he was quote-unquote rescued from his supposedly American captors by Russian authorities, ensuring his loyalty to the state. This whole scheme was largely overseen by a man named Alexei Bruskin, another notable Russian agent who once trained Natasha Romanov. Taking his father's middle name as an alias to obscure his identity, Yuri Petrovich donned the Mark III armor and became the 4th Crimson Dynamo. During this time, he also became romantically involved with the Russian mutant Lanya Petrovna, aka Dark Star. In his debut mission, Yuri was sent to America alongside Dark Star and the Titanium Man, the latter of which had once again pledged his service to the Russian government. The purpose of this trip was to retrieve 3 high-profile agents who had defected to the West: Natasha Romanov, Alexei Bruskin, and Yuri's father Ivan Petrovich Bezikov. At the time, however, the Black Widow was a member of the Los Angeles-based superhero team, the Champions, which of course led to a conflict between the two sides. On this job, the Russian agents also hired American criminals to help them, including Stuart Clark, aka Rampage, and more notably Johnny Horton, better known as the animalistic Griffin. In the ensuing conflict, Bruskin revealed the truth of how his work for the state had destroyed Ivan's family. However, Yuri refused to listen to either him or his father, and even turned on Dark Star after she released Bruskin from his bonds. The whole situation got pretty messy, and Bruskin was killed in the ensuing conflict, but in the end the Champions defeated and apprehended the Crimson Dynamo's allies, while Dark Star sided with Ivan and Natasha and actually wound up staying in America for a time. Dark Star was also the one who defeated Yuri, but still cared enough about him to spare his life, and the Crimson Dynamo returned to Russia alone. Displeased by his failure and his inability to keep his emotions in check, Russian authorities stripped Yuri Petrovich of his position, and when he tried to escape the country, he was taken down by the Winter Soldier, and ultimately sent to a work camp in Siberia. The Crimson Dynamo armor was then given to a more reliable agent, Corporal Dmitri Bukarin. When Dark Star later returned to Russia and resumed her role as a government operative alongside her brother Vanguard, Bukarin was assigned to operate alongside them. On a mission to the blue area of the moon, he briefly clashed with Iron Man, who mistook him for Nevsky, but the misunderstanding was ultimately cleared up, and the Russian operatives helped Iron Man and the Jack of Hearts prevent a group of alien colonizers from invading the Earth. Bukarin and his comrades also had brief encounters with other heroes like Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk, before they were joined by another Russian mutant, Ursa Major, and were organized into a formal group, the Soviet Super Soldiers. We've talked about that team on the channel before, as well as their clashes with rogue Russian scientists like the Presence and Professor Phobos, so refer to my video on the Soviet Super Soldiers for more details on their earliest exploits. The important thing for today is that Dark Star, Vanguard, and Ursa Major ultimately decided to break away from the government and operate independently, serving the Russian people rather than the state. The Dynamo remained with them for a time, aiding them in a battle against the Red Ghost, but he remained loyal to the government, causing the others to eventually evict him from the group. Bukarin was subsequently sent on the occasional solo mission, one of which pitted him against the likes of the Black Panther and the Human Torch. He was later given a much larger armored suit, the experimental Crimson Dynamo Mark IV-X, which greatly increased his strength. This version of the armor was reportedly designed by the young genius Kondraty Topolov, better known as the Gremlin, due to a disfiguring mutation inherited from his father. I will note that by this point the Gremlin had gone rogue after learning that the Russian government had been infiltrated by dire wraiths, ultimately joining forces with the Soviet super soldiers to combat them alongside the Space Knight Rom, and so he presumably worked on the Mark IV Crimson Dynamo armor sometime before all of that. The Gremlin later made a suit for himself based on the one worn by the Titanium Man, who was thought to be dead at the time, but I digress. Bukarin, meanwhile, was assigned to guard Russia's mutant containment facility, which was under the command of a biophysicist named Dr. Wolfgang Heinrich, himself a mutant who could duplicate the powers and appearance of other mutants, as he demonstrated with Iceman. This led to a confrontation with the other original X-Men, who at the time were operating as X-Factor. The Crimson Dynamo proved formidable, fighting the American mutants to a standstill, but unbeknownst to him, the X-Man Beast was fluent in Russian and overheard the code that Heinrich had used to confirm his identity. And so after the real Iceman defeated his doppelganger, he was able to use that code to impersonate Heinrich and order Bukarin to stand down, allowing X-Factor to escape. Bukarin subsequently donned a more compact version of the Mark IV armor as the larger experimental version was put into storage. After that, the Crimson Dynamo was sent to eliminate the mutant terrorist Magneto, and Dmitri convinced the Soviet super soldiers to aid him. For context, Magneto had previously launched attacks on Russia, sinking a manned submarine and causing a volcanic eruption that destroyed the city of Varikino, and while he had evaded consequences for that thus far, when falling magnetized fragments of his destroyed orbital headquarters, Asteroid M, caused an electromagnetic pulse that threatened more Russian lives, the government essentially used this as an excuse to send their agents on a mission to assassinate him. This incursion into the United States led to confrontations with the Avengers and the X-Men, and the whole conflict wound up exposing Dmitri Bukarin's anti-mutant sentiments, causing even more tension with his former teammates. Things came to a head when Dmitri sank a Dutch cargo ship in his search for Magneto, and while there were no recorded fatalities thanks to the efforts of the American heroes, the Crimson Dynamo was arrested by his own comrades and brought back to Russia. Despite this incident, the Russian government decided to continue employing Dmitri, in part because his retirement was quickly approaching. Also, at some point, both Dmitri's Crimson Dynamo armor and the Gremlin's Titanium Man armor were upgraded with stolen Stark technology. However, Iron Man then infiltrated Russia and used a specially designed negator pack to completely ruin any Stark-derived components in their suits. As a result, Dmitri's impending retirement was postponed while the government reworked and rebuilt the Crimson Dynamo armor. After that, he was given an army service extension and assigned to a new team, the Supreme Soviets, which included the artificial humanoid Sputnik, later known as Vostok, the Slavic thunder god Perrin, the sorceress Phantasma, and a new Red Guardian, Yosef Petkus. This group was primarily overseen and coordinated by a man named Colonel General Fyodor Shelkov. Meanwhile, a GRU officer, Colonel General Valentin Shatalov, coveted the Crimson Dynamo armor and sent Dmitri on a mission to retrieve the original Titanium Man in the United States, fully expecting him to fail. Sure enough, the ensuing clash between the Crimson Dynamo and the Titanium Man resulted in considerable property damage in New York, and the media coverage gave Valentin Shatalov the leverage he needed to eventually force Dmitri Bukarin into surrendering his armor. However, Shelkov still wanted Bukarin on his Supreme Soviets and provided him with a new battlesuit and a new code name, Airstrike. In the midst of all of this, the Supreme Soviets also changed their name due to the shifting political climate, instead becoming known as the People's Protectorate. Meanwhile, Valentin Shatalov became the 6th Crimson Dynamo, and initially plotted to restore Russia's communist government. To this end, he founded a group called Remont 4, notably recruiting the Titanium Man Boris Bulsky to his cause. By this point, Titanium Man's armor contained a technology developed by the expatriate scientist Sergei Simonov, which allowed it to be digitized and reduced to the size and shape of a credit card. This technology was then copied into the Crimson Dynamo's armor, allowing Shatalov to effectively store the suit in his belt buckle and quickly summon it. Shatalov subsequently tested this newly updated armor in a mock battle with another agent, Gregory Larionov, aka the Devastator. During this exercise, a peculiar confluence of circumstances caused Shatalov to switch bodies with Tony Stark from halfway across the world. The two explored each other's lives while each attempted to obtain military secrets. Also, it's heavily implied that Tony slept with Shatalov's subordinate/lover Yelena Brement, which is, a choice. In any event, before too long, the body swap was undone, and Stark's actions while in Shatalov's body discredited Shatalov in the eyes of the state. However, he won the respect of some in power when he accepted that the goals of his subversive Remont 4 organization were a political impossibility and disbanded the group. The Titanium Man, on the other hand, was less willing to abandon his cause, and when Tony Stark made peace with the Russian president and built a factory outside of Moscow, the Titanium Man went rogue and launched an unsanctioned attack on the facility. Despite the concerns of some, Valentin Shatalov was dispatched to battle his former ally, armed with a newly redesigned Mark V Crimson Dynamo armor. Shatalov was injured in the ensuing battle, but having come to respect Stark despite their differing political views, he convinced Iron Man to don the Crimson Dynamo armor so that the Russian people would see a Russian hero opposing the Titanium Man rather than a foreign one. However, Shatalov continued to control the Crimson Dynamo's weapons remotely, and in the end he used enough power to seemingly kill the Titanium Man. Bulsky did ultimately recover from his injuries, but Shatalov's rivals in the government nonetheless used this incident as an excuse to have him ousted from his position as the Crimson Dynamo, claiming that he'd overstepped his bounds. Dmitri Bukarin apparently regained the identity sometime after that, but when the People's Protectorate was reorganized into the Winter's Guard, which included Darkstar and Vanguard, Bukarin was excluded due to his anti-mutant sentiments. After that, the prototype Mark IV-X was stolen by an unidentified Soviet loyalist who battled Captain America while working for a former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, David Ferrari, aka The Answer, as the two embarked on a world-conquering plot. This Crimson Dynamo was defeated and his armor was damaged when Nick Fury ran him over with a tractor. When the Latvian Prime Minister, Lucia von Bardis, subsequently bankrolled the criminal inventor Phineas Mason, aka the Tinkerer, the unidentified Crimson Dynamo was among the many tech-based villains to receive upgrades from him, resulting in a modified version of the Mark IV-X. He and the other upgraded villains were later summoned to New York at Von Bardis's behest to battle a group of heroes assembled by Nick Fury, and were ultimately defeated. Meanwhile, Anton Vanko's prototype Mark II helmet was found in an old Moscow warehouse by 17-year-old Gennady Gavrilov. Mistaking it for a video game peripheral, he brought the helmet home and put it on, inadvertently activating the rest of the suit remotely, causing it to break free from its Siberian storage facility. As the armor marched from Siberia to Moscow, Gavrilov realized that it was far more than just a game, while at the same time a French criminal named Alexandre Devereaux and his organization, the Consortium, also sought to claim it. In the end, with help from Tony Stark, Gavrilov was able to gain full control over the armor and keep it out of the wrong hands, subsequently storing it in a hidden basement beneath an unsuspecting furniture plant. By this point, however, enough suits had been made by different people that Crimson Dynamo technology began to show up on the black market, resulting in a number of unsanctioned imitators. One such copycat fought Iron Man in New York and barely survived the battle. Several others were outfitted and employed by advanced idea mechanics, but these were wiped out by a team of Gamma mutates, the Gamma Corps. The Russian government, meanwhile, instituted a federal Dynamo program to train more armored agents. By this point, Dmitri Bukarin had retired from field work, but was granted a personal Crimson Dynamo armor for his service, and was later appointed to be the strategic liaison for the Winter Guard. Meanwhile, a new Crimson Dynamo test pilot Boris Vadim was inducted into the Winter Guard alongside a new Dark Star and a new Red Guardian. He debuted the bulky Mark VI Crimson Dynamo armor, but more often wore a version of the Gremlin-designed Mark IV. He went on several missions with the team, but was eventually killed when a rogue Russian scientist known as the Presence mutated the former spy Igor Drenkov into a gamma-powered protoplasmic monster that ate Vadim. In the wake of his death, a woman named Galina Nemirovsky, a promising graduate of the federal Dynamo program, became his replacement. However, she had difficulty following orders and was ultimately removed from the team for insubordination. She went rogue and absconded with the larger Ultra Dynamo armor before working for Ezekiel S.I.N and the Mandarin, and obtaining a completely redesigned suit, which included a light cloak that S.I.N had copied from Stark Designs, as well as retrofitted Dire Wraith technology. In any event, it seems that you can't keep a good Dynamo down, and during a subsequent time of escalating global tension, the Winter's Guard roster was revamped to include many veteran members, and Dmitri Bukarin was convinced to rejoin, donning the Mark VI Crimson Dynamo armor. Valentin Shatalov has also subsequently resurfaced, having reclaimed his Mark V armor, and so we've now reached the point where there are multiple Crimson Dynamos running around, some new, some old, some agents of the Russian state, some rogue criminals using black market armors. That, however, is all I have for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!